Okay, it looks like the numbers are starting to slow down, so let's go ahead and get started. Greetings, everyone. I'm Rose Dangerfield. I work at the Columbia Chamber, and I'm here today on behalf of Carl Blackstone and our whole team. Carl is juggling a couple of other calls that happen to just fall at the same time, so you get to have some time with me today. I see some names and faces that have been joining us this week, so I'm glad that you're here with us today. Our guest today, and I really want to thank our folks over at Chernoff Newman, great folks over there doing good work, for offering up Peter LaMotte to talk to us about crisis communications. I think we're probably all finding some new tips and some new things we didn't know during all of this. So Peter's been doing this for quite a while, obviously not in the coronavirus era, but he's been in political and other areas. So hang on as I respond. Some people don't have sound. Anna is working behind the scenes on this. So let me give her just a second to see if she's testing audio. Are other folks having trouble with sound? Okay, good. At least some people are hearing me. So now you've got sound. Okay. Thumbs up, we'll keep going with that. But we are just a couple of housekeeping items. Let me move that chat so that I can see Peter's screen. Just if we have everyone on mute, so if you have a question, if you'll just do it in the group chat, we'll be sure to get to all the questions, or we'll do our best. We will also have this recording up later today. We put it on our website so that if you want to go back and check a point or look at something, we'll have it there for you. And also, if you don't get your question answered, please send it to info@columbiachamber.com. We'll be monitoring that. And if we can't get the answer, we'll get it over to Peter and his team, or we'll punt it somewhere else if it needs to go. So with that said, welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn the control over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Rose. Let me know, as Rose said, we're all trying to figure this out. So if you can't see anything, if you can't hear us, just let us know. First and foremost, thank you to Rose and the Columbia Chamber in behalf on Chernoff Newman. Thanks for everyone for your time. I realize all of our days are not as they once were, and trying to juggle something like a webinar into your busy days when you're balancing life. I really do appreciate the time. Hopefully we're going to get a lot out of this. The title is Crisis Communications During the Coronavirus. You really could just remove the first word there. It's really more about communications during the coronavirus, purposely calling it Learning as We Go, and relying on what we know. And that just alludes to the fact that we're all in this together. This is totally new. There is no script for this. There is no crisis plan for global pandemics, at least not here in the US. And so what the purpose of this presentation today is to simply walk through the fundamentals that you should be considering whenever you are communicating. And those are grounded in crisis communications, but they really do need to be applied across the board. So I start most of these crisis communications presentations, even pre-coronavirus, with a quote, because as I mentioned, we're dealing with something that is completely unprecedented. We're all learning as we go, but what we need to remember is, even though in times like this, what we're dealing with is unique, the way in which we deal with a crisis is always going to be built off of core fundamental operational procedures that will work if you pay attention to them. And if you choose to ignore them, they're going to work against you. And the Andy Grove quote, I use it all the time: bad companies are destroyed by crisis, good companies can survive them, and great companies come out of this improved. And so we need to look for ways to be our best communicators, look for ways that our company can evolve in this moment and be stronger because of it. We're limited on time. I'm going to try and do this as quickly as I can, but here's how the agenda is sort of laid out. At the end of the call, go through questions. If you have any, pop it up in chat. I will tell you, it's a little difficult for me to look at the slides, look at my notes, and look at chat. So I promise we'll get through any questions you may have. We'll jump back to slides that you need us to, but we'll work through this. Also, you can, as Rose mentioned, you can always reach out to us, Chernoff Newman or myself. You'll see an email address at the end, even a phone number. Feel free. We're here to help. This is it's just an unprecedented time, as I mentioned, and really the way we're going to get through this is by helping each other in any way we can. So first, the fundamentals. I want to start with a basic overview of communications in a crisis. It is conceptual, but it's really important, and I'll show you as we go through how companies are dealing with this, how you should be dealing with it. It's important with everything you do, and it's important to understand how someone in my field who's dealing with issues management, reputation management, crisis management, how they look at the situation. Because it not only applies to any given crisis, but it applies to how you should be communicating with all of your stakeholders. The way we look at it from our perspective is a crisis will come, and they tend to come very quickly. In today's world versus 1982, and a lot of you either may remember or have heard about the 1982 Tylenol crisis. Those days are gone. In today's world, crises come fast, they come without warning, they come without context. And whereas a company back in the 80s, the early 80s, as Tylenol was dealing with, they could think of what their public response was going to be. They could take that response, check with legal, they could check with their stakeholders, their partners, have a structured, planned out conversation with the media outlet. And now we're looking at literally hours to deal with a crisis when it hits. And our crisis for all of us is here, and we are all dealing with it. The crisis of the coronavirus presents a situation that last hit the world before the average person had telephones. So think about that for a second. We can relate to a crisis that hit, say, before computers were widespread. Think about a crisis, 9/11 hit before social media. But we can understand that. But now we're dealing with a crisis that is affecting millions of people here in the United States, everyone really, in real time news alerts, real-time misinformation, real-time rumors, real-time panic amongst your employees, your customers, your partners, yourselves. And trust me, it's going to continue to get worse because nothing is going to change in the immediate future. The numbers are going to grow, the restrictions on our lives continue to mount, and our businesses have been turned upside down. And none of us really know when it's going to get back to normal. But we can have some control over this. We can control how you can handle it, because these crises, they happen every single day in some concept, concept to many different companies. And while this is most likely the biggest crisis that your business is ever going to face, you have to decide now how you're going to handle it, because a few things are true no matter what. And whether it's global or specific to your business, there are similarities. Most important, there are three people involved in any crisis, no matter what it is. The villain, that's who do we blame, the victim, who is harmed by this crisis, and the vindicator, who's going to be the hero, who's going to save the day. But here is why response time and how you respond is so important. Because depending on how well prepared you are, depending when and how you respond, even if your plan is to not respond at all, that decision is what matters. Now, it's a little bit different right now. The villain is more, there's no location, there's no race, there's no time, there's no one person that we can point out. The victim is everybody, from the top to the bottom, from our children to the elderly, to every business, to every nonprofit, to every organization. Everyone is a victim. And you have to look for your role on how you can be the vindicator. And communications is core at setting that role. Because the reputational damage that your organization may have or the reputational benefit that your organization may have in a crisis is based first on one primary thing, and that's preparation. The only way you can possibly be able to handle a reputational threat without incurring any damage is to be prepared. Now, large firms have dozens of crisis plans. Small firms need to have them too. Now, that's not to say you have to have the binders upon binders that a big corporation has, but you can't simply put your head in the sand either. One of the things that I'll often do is help a company decide whether they need to worry about a specific threat to their business. Now, this is a chart I've created for a lot of the clients, and it's how to essentially organize fear. Where does your server outage fall? What about a security breach? Are you getting sued? Is there negative press? Is there a CEO resignation? They can all be categorized. How you prepare for them is based on where they fall on a chart. Now, my argument is you should be prepared for anything that falls into that green or blue range. For example, if you have a frequent and catastrophic business risk way up there on the left, I'm not worried about you. You're out of business anytime now. If you are regularly having catastrophic and frequent attacks on your business, you need to reevaluate your business. If the crisis is that improbable and it's going to be negligible on your business, you shouldn't be spending cycles worrying about it. We could have never predicted the coronavirus per se, but this threat has been knocking at our door far too often. From a global standpoint, whether it was Ebola or SARS, we all knew that this was a possibility here. And we should have some sort of plan on how, if there is a global shutdown of the economy, maybe it's not that broad, but at least what is our worst case scenario for our business? But if you don't have one, don't worry about it, because like I said, we're figuring this out as we go. But let's talk about what you do when you're actually in a crisis. You have to decide how you're going to handle it. But as I've mentioned a few times now, there are a few things that are true no matter what that crisis is. We'll get to questions, but I want to make sure we go through these quickly, and I'm happy to answer any of those questions as we get to the other side of this. Like I said, 5 core ideas. The first one is timing. Now, a typical crisis, it's recommended that you should respond within an hour. But that's more of an adage on a singular forcing event, an event that affects your business with one acute action, a moment, or a very short time. What we're dealing with now is a very different territory. This crisis ebbs and it flows, and it's unlike any crisis that any of us have dealt with. We've maybe known about the coronavirus for months, but that's kind of irrelevant on how we communicate. Had companies started issuing statements back in January when this was just a threat in Asia, it wouldn't have made any strategic sense. However, now that we see, when we saw it spreading to Europe, that's when we needed to start thinking about it. We have to start preparing for scenarios when we see them on the horizon. But your typical crisis doesn't give you that kind of time. It happens when you're trying to do your business on any given day and operate, just keeping things moving. For example, you see on the right side of the slide, this is the 2017 April incident with United Airlines, where they forcibly kicked a passenger headed to Kentucky off an aircraft. And the reason I use this, it was possibly the worst handling of a crisis event in at least, last few years, maybe the decade. Not only was the handling poorly executed as far as timing, and they were late to get to the response, but also poor leadership amidst crisis. And we're going to talk a lot about the importance of leadership in a crisis. They issued conflicting statements. At one point, United even went so far to blame the customer, who had all the visuals, if nothing else, on his side, being pulled from a plane, bludgeoned, bleeding. It's a hard visual to get away from. And this is important to remember when we look at our 3 players. Dr. Dow, the gentleman who was removed from the plane, had already been cast as the victim by the public. Maybe United was trying, hoping to reassign that role, but they only solidified their position by trying to blame him for the incident. And as far as timing is concerned, United didn't execute an official corporate response until 18 hours after this started spreading on social media. By that time, they've lost total control of the situation. So let's keep moving through these quickly. Brevity. The harsh way to put this is no one wants to read your long-winded explanation of what's going on. The old school press release shouldn't be longer than 400 words. That's roughly 1 minute of reading. But even with that 1 minute of reading, it overlooks a little thing called social media. People don't want to take an entire minute to read your response to a crisis. They want to read your Facebook post, and then they will decide whether or not you have earned the right for them to click on the link or expand the statement to the remaining 350 words. So just remember this. It's a phrase that a former colleague of mine explained to me when I first left the advertising world to get into the communications world. And keep in mind, this statement goes against human nature. So channel your mother. How well does but he started it, or but it wasn't my fault, go over when you're in trouble as a kid? The audience doesn't care. So just remember, if you are having to explain what you did, if you're having to explain the nuances of the situation, you're already losing the argument. Right now, the third point is possibly the most important one: empathy. Rarely are we in the midst of a crisis that everyone can relate to, where everyone has questions, fears, where no one really has enough answers. And honestly, at every level, people are scared. I went and looked through my email a couple weeks ago to see who was the first notable coronavirus email that I received from a brand. Now, considering that Washington State was one of the first to be hit by this, it's no shock that Alaskan Airlines was that. But take a look at the tone of the copy. It exudes empathy for the reader. Uncertainty can be unsettling. Our hearts go out to those who have been impacted. Our top priority is always the safety of you and our employees. And they're not pandering to say, like, come on back and book some more flights. It's about the customer, but it's also about their team too. Because in times like this, people separate employees from corporate leadership. And the public will empathize with the employees who can also be seen as victims. I tend to use a lot of airline examples. They tend to have a lot of issues, but let me show you one from spring of 2017. Now, this happened right after the United event, and it was a bit of the United one was worst case scenario. American handled this quickly and well. And if you didn't see it, there was an employee who brought this mother and her child to tears. It was caught on social media. Other passengers were getting involved. And as you can see in this, immediately they responded with, "We are deeply sorry for the pain we have caused this passenger and her family, and to any other customers affected by the incident." So a leader in crisis has to display a sense of confidence, while at the same time, they need to express signs of empathy towards those who were hurt and potentially harmed by the crisis. We'll talk about the second half of that statement in a second. But empathy or lack of empathy is never forgotten. Case in point, 2010 BP oil crisis. This was one line taken from a much larger statement. A reporter went to, it was a press conference, and to the CEO, all these people here, I think it was in Louisiana, they want to just get their lives back. How long is that going to take? And the CEO responded in a way that many of us might respond the same way. I want my life back too. But when you're the CEO who has inflicted the pain, you have to be incredibly careful about what you say, because this one line haunted BP for years. So that's why it's so important to plan out exactly what you're going to say. Transparency is the fourth piece of this. The most important word is to say you're sorry. Um, but apologies aren't just about taking blame. They're about showing that empathy, but showing that you understand how the customer feels, showing genuinely that you are sorry for what has happened, and regardless of the fact of how you got there. Now, the example that you have up here is from JetBlue, and this was probably, and you can see it's from 2007. It's getting a little old, but the reason I use it is because it was the first time that a CEO used YouTube, which was a pretty young platform at the time, to actually spread the message across social media. And it was an amazing opportunity for a CEO and one of the early ones to use social media to reach out and say they are sorry and we are going to fix this and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that transparency of sharing exactly how you were going to fix it is so important. Just yesterday, this is yesterday. Now, ironically, we're on a Zoom call, but you've probably seen the articles of Zoom security lapses. He came out, said, we messed up. And we were talking about it, Rose and I were talking about it right before we started. Zoom issued a new update to their software today to address some of these. The next slide, this is not by any means to be political. Obama was seen as a really good communicator, and this quote comes from 2009. In the midst, this was considered a crisis. Obama had to pull a nomination of Tom Daschle because it discovered he hadn't paid taxes. But look at the copy. He came out within hours of this hitting the news, and he said, I screwed up. I take responsibility for it, and we are going to make sure we fix it so it doesn't happen again. This is essentially how you write the apology letter. The other piece is the solution. Now, you have to promise to solve the problem, but then you have to actually solve the problem. Some people may forget, but there are always going to be those who remember and hold you accountable. That I promise. So, you can't solve coronavirus. It's just impossible. It's an unsolvable external threat, but your actions can help mitigate the problems. We'll see this when we talk a little bit later about communicating with employees. You have to be seen as helping in this situation. Any statement without that part of it is you're losing the most powerful message you can convey. People don't want to hear your empathy and that you're sorry unless you actually are doing something to help them. Going back to that American Airlines quote, look at the bottom. This is exactly how they were solving the problem. After electing to take another flight, we are taking special care of her and her family and upgrading them to first class for the remainder of their international trip. The American team member has been removed from duty while we immediately investigate this incident. That last sentence is important. They issued this not after an investigation, not after all the facts had come to light. They issued this when they were still trying to figure it out, but they knew the roles were being assigned. And so they had to address it, and they did it in a really good way. So let's review all three of those again. In any communications, once again, I know it says crisis communications, but think about, we are in a global crisis. So any communications you are doing right now, go through this checklist, just in the back of your head, whether it's to a customer, to an employee group, to your partners. Have you responded quickly enough? Are you getting your point across quickly enough? Are you showing your audience that you genuinely care about them? Are you being transparent about your actions? And are you providing a solution to the issue, or at least trying to provide a solution to the issue? That's the fundamentals. How do we execute it? Well, pick your path. This is just a few of them. I tried to get them into big buckets, and you probably need to pick more than just one. How and when you convey your message is dependent on the situation. There's no question about it. Some make sense. Dark site, if you guys know what that is a hidden website for crises that you know are coming down the path. It's a website with preloaded information, and when the crisis hits, you just update it. Social media, public engagement, press events, just content in general, whether that's blogs, video, buying SEM terms. Look at the current situation that we're in. Pick a major corporation that you deal with on a regular basis so that you pay attention to. I guarantee you that you can go down this list of how they're communicating about the coronavirus. They probably have a section on their website. They probably sent you an email. Maybe it's a press release around the actions they're taking, a video or two, or maybe something like this. Maybe they're helping through a webinar. Just got to figure out what path makes sense, or which paths make sense for the situation. So let's talk about specifically what we're dealing with today. How do we communicate where we can, keep our heads down, but also keep our heads on straight, where we don't make a mistake that's going to affect our long-term reputation, our long-term brand, our employees' morale, very important right now, and also our customers' confidence in us. I can't stress this enough. Use common sense. In fact, surround yourself and your business with rational people that understand a path of business resiliency for your organization. You cannot sit around and wait for things to happen, but you can't also live in a panic. Because here's the thing about panic. It creates fear. And when people are fearful, they start seeing enemies and challenges that simply aren't there. You need to have the smartest, most level-headed people in your organization in leadership roles. You have enough challenges in your business on any given day. Now you need the people who are focused on helping your company and your customers and your employees to get through to the other side of this crisis. Think back to that empathy slide. No one wants to think that you have ulterior motives for your care and concern. No customer wants to think that you're reaching out simply to secure the revenue stream. Likewise, employees don't want you checking in for that to come across as, just checking on their productivity. Of course, we need to worry about our bottom line. There's no question about that. We need to be genuinely concerned about that. But we also need to be genuinely concerned on the safety of our stakeholders. So look for ways that you can support them both in doing their job, but in balancing their lives. Help them with tips on how to stay safe. Most likely over the next few weeks, you're going to see ebbs and flow in productivity. Be a resource for those stakeholders, not a nuisance. Now, there are three major realities that make communications harder now than ever. A general deterioration in trust, a massive proliferation of misinformation, and really the normalization of misinformation. It's in such disarray that a week or so ago, I saw a very reputable news outlet dismissing a report as fake news, only to the next day be the fake news itself because the report turned out to be 100% true. That's the world we live in now, when everyone is trying to fill the airways, when everyone is trying to share their opinion and what they know. Misinformation is at a rise. So this was a study that was done by the Institute for Public Relations and Peppercom. Now, it comes from just a few weeks ago, and it shows the trust in different organizations. And it isn't just who you trust when you're sharing information. Make sure that you're using news sources that everyone trusts. The data here shows World Health Organization, CDC are at the highest levels of that. So CDC, National Health Service, overseas, WHO, people believe when data is coming from them. Local agencies like DHEC, are also very high. Hospitals, medical experts, mainstream media is down at 19%. Leadership of our country, presidents, prime ministers, this is global, is down at 9%. So make sure that you're not sharing news that necessarily comes from, WebMD, nothing against WebMD, or something you saw on social media. Make sure it's coming from reputable sources. And if you think this is a no-brainer, know that the chief medical officer of CVS made the mistake of including information that included complete falsehood. Now, they had to go back and retract it, but that's CVS and the chief medical officer that had misinformation in his communications to all employees. So it's important to pay attention to. The facts are changing rapidly, maybe a little less rapidly than they were 2 weeks ago. And while all of us have news outlets, sometimes they simply aren't fast enough for the nuance of what you're looking for. The PRSA, the Public Relations Society of America, they suggest a 3X policy, where when you are communicating with your customers and employees on a regular basis, that you should be checking in on the news at least 3 times a day. Now, operationally, let's talk about that. You are never too small to have a crisis plan. So maybe it's not the big binders that we talked about earlier that a lot of corporations have, but you should have plans around communications and how you're going to react. Who will be the point person for communications, for example, especially as it relates to, a lot of us are going to be looking at layoffs. A lot of us are going to be looking at major revenue shortfalls. You can prepare for those now, even if they haven't happened. But here's what's interesting about the current situation. Near 50% of major corporations, those people that hire crisis communications firms, those people that should be infinitely prepared, 50% of them had no crisis plan that would deal with this situation in any way. So the fact that you don't have one is nothing to be ashamed about. Create the crisis team. When you have, let's just take something that a lot of people have reached out to us about. How do we communicate with layoffs? Know who is on that crisis team. Who is going to be, from a communication standpoint, from an HR standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, who is going to be the small group, not everyone. You do not want to make a decision by committee. Who is going to be the small group that decides how this is going to be communicated? Make sure that you are communicating first internally and quickly thereafter externally. And make sure that you are communicating regularly with stockholders, shareholders, investors, close business partners. And then also make sure that you are communicating proactively, that on a regular basis, you are touching base with all of your stakeholders. So that's the fundamentals. Let's talk about individual questions. How does this actually get executed? Building plans, identifying risks, all those things that we've talked about. But what are the common questions that we at Chernoff Newman are either helping our clients with or fielding calls from people just looking for help? One of the top ones, and I put it first because we've gotten enough times that we've written a blog post about it, is how do you communicate with your employees when someone in your organization is either directly or indirectly impacted by the coronavirus? Well, here's a perfect example to use those 5 tenets. First of all, let's go back. Timing. You need to notify your employees relatively quickly after you find out about these things. Brevity. Cut straight to the point. People want to know what's going on. Empathy. When people hear that a colleague is either sick or a family member of a colleague is sick, it's scary. It's now closer to home than just the news reports. So show that concern for the person, their family, or whoever it is. Transparency. Remind people of the protocols and how your organization is set up to actually respond. And then solution. Provide the solution, what you're doing today, what you plan on doing tomorrow. All of that goes into the communications. It's a perfect example on how those fundamentals of crisis communications are part of all communications right now. Another question for those of you that have events further out. Obviously, those that are taking place this month and most likely next month, you've already dealt with this. But if you have something in August or something in July that you're trying to decide on still, the three points of this is, you need to consult with the stakeholders that are involved. Consult with your legal counsel regarding contracts. Consult with your insurance provider. What's your liability if you do have it in July and someone gets sick? Consult with credible sources. We talked about DHEC. Don't rely on the media to say things are going to be better in July. Make sure that you're checking on that. Also, recognize that at the end of the day, this needs to be a business decision based on data, concrete, rational data. If you choose to have your event and take place, recognize that attendees are going to have really valid questions. So make sure that you have responses and publish them so that people know where to find them. If you decide to cancel, same thing. What are the financial ramifications? But be prepared for all of the communications that are going to trickle down from that decision. If you have the time, come up with contingency planning now rather than later. The bottom line is not to give into panic, not to cancel things because it just feels right. Make sure that you have the data and that your decision is being based on the best information you have today. Now, how often should I be communicating with my employees? Now, this is a question we've been talking about for a few weeks now. I suspect by now most of you have a pretty good cadence on how you're talking to your clients. I think I said employees earlier, I mean clients. But if by chance you don't, make sure that you start engaging with your clients on a regular basis. Don't make it too salesy. Just make them aware of the fact that you're there for them, no matter what. And yes, this goes for the ones that have either paused their contracts, canceled contracts. If you are there for them now, when they get back on their feet, when they get back to the other side, they will remember this communications. And like I said, a lot of this going on right now is based on fear. And those of us who are there for our stakeholders, whether they be employees, investors, or clients, those are going to be the ones that our clients turn to when this is all said and done. What about employees? We at Chernoff Newman communicate daily. I highly recommend some touch point on a daily basis. Keep them up to date on what's going on. A crisis craves structure. Give them that structure, especially your employees. It can be similar content every day. It doesn't have to be unique. It doesn't need to be profound. That email that they see arriving in their inbox on any given day, that normality is what people are craving now. So who in my company should be the one communicating to stakeholders? Now, typically in issues related to employees, you might turn to the head of HR for being the point person, or if there's a major misstep due to say an ad campaign, it might be your head of marketing. I've always been of the mindset that if there's a chance that things could escalate, hold off on using the CEO so that you can take it to a higher power if you need to change your story. But in the case of coronavirus, I think you need to start with the CEO if it's media related, if it's externally related. Maybe the president when dealing with employee communications, but keep it a authority. Remember, when events are completely out of our control, when out of our hands like a virus, it's the leadership that's needed, and that leadership needs to come from the top. So when is it safe to communicate that all is well? I can't tell you that. No one really can. What we've learned by seeing in China and the news yesterday is that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We don't know when that's going to be for our market. So my suggestion is going back to that trusted list of outlets and experts. See what the CDC is saying. See what the World Health Organization is saying. Look to your peers in your associations and what are they doing and how are they responding. The dominoes have continued to fall against us, but I promise you the dominoes will fall for the better, and we will get through the worst of this. So sort of as a all in, what questions should I be asking? What am I not asking my organization? The one that we get on a regular basis is, how is productivity of our business? How is it going to be impacted? How do we communicate effectively? A lot of that can be addressed through the tools that I think many of you are using. Zoom, many of you on this call probably didn't use Zoom prior to the coronavirus outbreak. Look for tools that allow you to communicate with your employees more effectively. Look for guardrails in your organization. Because we are all virtual, you need to be careful not to assume that your employees and your customers are 24/7. What you don't want to do is use these wonderful tools that we have at our disposal to put an unrealistic stress on your employees who are already stressed, to assume that if you're slacking them at 10 o'clock at night because you as a leader are up at 10 o'clock at night, there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that you're communicating that that's what you're doing. I'm putting this on here now. You don't need to get back to me right now, but didn't want to forget about it. Same with email communications and video communications. I will tell you some of the feedback that we are getting from employees of many of our clients is that this incessant Zoom calling, that people feel like they are just on a Zoom call. It's like being in meetings all day. It's deteriorating the morale of a lot of employees. So just be careful on how often you are using these tools that keep productivity high. And what about the question that we also get is, when productivity starts to drop, how do we let down our customers? And this is one of the things that when you have employees that either are saying, look, I can't do it anymore. You can imagine in the healthcare space, people not coming in. You need to know how you are going to communicate with those customers and clients when you have a shortfall in your ability, and how, going back to everything we said with the brevity and empathy, but also what's the solution? What are you doing? Show that transparency, show that solution. How do you have a workable and stress-tested communications plan in the midst of a crisis? Well, you can't have it necessarily for the exact crisis that you are in, but you can have it for the crisis that is coming down the pipe. You can have it for the crisis that on that chart of what is possible. You should have, it doesn't have to be the binders. It can be one page. This is how we're going to react. This is what our messaging is going to be around. This is who's going to communicate. This is the channel in which we are going to communicate. This is the follow-up actions that we will take when we do that. It does not need to be as robust as something that would be devised for a big corporate environment. But you should have some workable, stress-tested communications plans for what's going to happen because of the crisis that we are all living in. And stress-tested, all that means is that you've run through it, you've picked it apart, you've said, well, this could happen, this might not happen, and think about all the scenarios. And then the one thing I would ask in your communications is make sure that you are balancing the process with the human approach. It's very easy for us to get clinical when dealing with these things, but as touchy-feely as it may sound, you have to keep in mind that our actions are affecting human beings and how they are going to react. Let's go back to the core of what crisis communications is about. It's about maintaining your reputation before, during, and after a crisis. So when we go back to that Andy Grove quote that was on slide 2, if you have your plans set out, if you have thought about how you are going to react and you follow the fundamentals of how you are going to react, you will come out of this as a stronger company than you went into it. Maybe not from a revenue standpoint, because we're all dealing with a massive change in the economy. But if you have the ability to communicate with your stakeholders, whether they be your clients, your prospects, your investors, more effectively, faster timing, brevity, empathy, transparency, and providing solutions for them, you will be a stronger organization. So we're about 50 minutes into this, and I can't thank you enough for everyone and the Columbia Chamber for asking me to do this. You know, I'll say it again. We need to support each other. We need to support each other as a region, as a state, as a country right now. And this week and next month, and that's the only way we're going to get through this storm. And I say that as a precursor to say to you, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any questions, this is my email, this is a cell phone number, because none of us are sitting at our offices anymore. Feel free to reach out. If you just have a question or a concern about your business and you're afraid that you might be making an error, or you just want to stress test it, feel free to reach out. I am happy to talk to you about these things. You can reach out on Twitter, you can reach out on LinkedIn, you can reach out with this information. Whatever works for you, feel free to reach out to us. And I just appreciate this opportunity. Hopefully it's been worthwhile. Thank you again.
Thanks, Peter. That was terrific. I got a lot of gold nuggets out of that. I'm not sure I could write quickly enough to remember them all. I want to thank you and especially your team over at Chernoff Newman. You're just such an important part of our community. Coming from having been a client and also been on the agency side, I would urge everyone on this call, listen to what Peter said, you know, give them a call, reach out to them. If it's not about what you're trying to do right now today, maybe it's about what you do when you get on the other side. And I think we're all looking forward to being on the other side. But Peter's information is here. We'll have this up on our website a little bit later today. If you want to go back and pick up that quote or get some info from that, it'll be there. Or remember, you can send questions to our info@columbiachamber.com. If it's specific for Peter or folks at his team, I'll get it over to them. If it's related to some of the other topics that we've had, then we'll be sure to get you an answer on that. So it is high noon, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.